Hey, Scott, welcome to Mass Construction Show.
Morning, Joe.
Thanks for making the ride up from Rhode Island.
No, absolutely.
I know you I would say, you do the majority of your work in Massachusetts?
I'd say 70% Massachusetts, and then maybe 20% Rhode Island, and then maybe 10% Connecticut.
Yeah.
Actually, there's a small piece up in New Hampshire and Maine.
Yeah. And then do you still run anything down south?
Yes, actually, I'm sorry then. So then another piece.
Your math is off.
Yeah. Another piece of the pie where I wish I was down there more often, but in North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida.
Great. Yeah. So what's that? 20% down south, and then 80% northeast.
Yeah. So if you were to reshuffle the deck, yeah.
So probably realistically 50-60% of the business is mass, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Nice. So we're here today to talk about scheduling. A while back we had Bill Perry on, who's a friend of yours. I know you guys work together quite a bit, and I think we got more into the claims side of things. But
yes, that's his wheelhouse.
Yeah.
Yep.
So today what we're hoping to do is more of a pure scheduling conversation, and it was funny because I'm seeing a theme here. Like, I've done episodes with PMs where they talk about project management. I did 2 with them, 2 episodes with the same 2 people. Both of those episodes are in the top 10 most listened to. And then I did the purchasing episode with the 2 purchasers that we were just looking at.
Right.
And you could see out of the gate that it was getting a ton of traction from a listen's perspective. So I think people not that they would want it every week, but they like just episodes that are just talk about project management, talk about
real issues.
Yeah, even the superintendent's one, they were in the top 10 as well. So talk about being a superintendent, a scheduler, I keep wanting to say procurement, purchasing. I think people like these kind of purebred, like, let's just get down and dirty and talk about construction topics.
So they're real topics. I mean, we deal with it day to day.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm excited. And it's a good place for people to get better, right? If they're a project manager, learning about scheduling is huge. Well, learning about purchasing is huge. So
lessons learned. We always want to try and do the next job better.
Yep. Yeah. I just, we're chit-chatting a lot here, but this is good. I just actually posted something. Callahan, I was out there for a book club. They were nice enough to invite me out there to sit in on their book club and join them. And I read the book and everything. But while we were there, this Tony, who's their outside super or general super, whatever they call it, was showing me they have a lessons learned app where all the employees, as they
contribute to it,
they can add to it, and they're just starting to populate it. So as time grows, and you can search by doors or exterior envelope, and it'll pop up, and you'll see, hey, what are the problems we've had on other jobs before?
Like specific QA/QC issues.
Yeah,
nice.
It was pretty neat. It was impressive, and they're just getting warmed up on that. So that's exciting.
Are they sharing that with other companies, or is that just internal?
I think it's just internal.
Yep.
But they were nice enough to give me some screenshots so I could share it so other people could see kind of how they go about
awesome.
it. But yeah, so I think a great place to start, seeing we're going to be down and dirty here, is like, what are the basics of good scheduling practices? If someone's kind of starting off or says, hey, I want to take a diagnostic look at my place, what are some of the things they should be doing?
Absolutely. So schedules are broken into 2 components, Joe. One of them is the baseline, and then we have the subsequent updates. And pretty much what I'm going to talk about now are what should be in a baseline schedule, so that we can go back and reference to that, Joe, because a lot of times we get caught up in other subject matters, which are more of updates, but talking more about what should be out the door in a baseline schedule.
Would you delineate between a baseline schedule and a contract schedule, or would you consider them kind of one and the same?
That's a good question, because I deal with this all the time. So a contract schedule, not to get off topic enough,
go for it.
A contract schedule is usually a high level, couple pages, that they're usually sharing with the owner on the onset of a project. And again, I'm kind of talking more of not hard bid municipal type projects. I'm talking about ones that are GMP, negotiated with owners. They usually have maybe a 3 or 4 page schedule with milestones, and I call it summary level detail, Joe. So, I mean, that's a contract schedule. And then the question I often ask is, how do you take that contract schedule and now roll it over to the detailed execution plan? which is really going to be the true baseline schedule for the project that you're going to measure against in terms of variances, gains, and losses. So the contract schedule, I'm not going to talk too much about that. I call that more like eye candy. It's just this pretty looking bar chart with dates. And, we have to hold to those dates because those are in our contract, but they really don't have the detail in them like a baseline schedule should.
So not fully populated, not getting the nitty gritty of this kind of milestones with dates.
Yep.
And then from that, you're saying, okay, we need to populate this now
Correct.
with the right amount of detail, right level of detail.
And that's one of the questions I often ask customers and clients that, you and I go to or wherever I've been to is, how do you take that contract schedule and now blow it out to this detailed execution baseline schedule? And I've heard different applications from different companies, but at the end of the day, you should be getting to some level of detail, which is what we're going to talk about.
Yeah. So where's a good first place to start?
So
want to set up your schedule.
So my thing is, instead of just starting the keystroke information into the schedule, you should have like a basic planning scheduling session and talk about the major categories or phases of a project. I call it the life cycle of the project. And, usually that starts off, depending on the time your project is the design done? So you would have a design section if it's not done yet. And then you would have a pre-construction section. And then from there, you would go into procurement. And then you would go into coordination, construction, and closeout. And again, these are just categories that all the details should be falling under. And, these 5 or 6 categories that I just mentioned, I've seen some places where they don't have all those categories captured in the baseline schedule. And probably my biggest one I'm going to pick on is procurement. I think that's a shortfall with a lot of schedules. But those are the 5 or 6 major categories that we should absolutely have in each schedule, in each baseline.
And that's from a textbook standpoint, what they'd call like a work breakdown structure.
Yes, yeah.
So the work breakdown structure is those, what we'll call kind of headings.
Yeah.
And you say the most common one you're seeing missing is procurement.
Yeah.
This seems like a basic question, but what goes into procurement? Because that could be kind of looked at.
It's kind of a generic
ways.
So that's basically the bid and award of getting a vendor on board, and then the submittals, and then the fabricate and delivery. And a lot of times I'll just see like one line items, if they do have them in the schedule, just called procurement of switchgear. And it's like 280 days in duration. Well, what is that made up of? And how do you track it? And that's where you get into updates more. But, I when I see procurement typically in schedules, a lot of places they don't have it. Or if they do have it, they have it at this higher level, which maybe that was in the contract schedule, Joe, that we just talked about. And it should actually be broken down into finite detail of actually getting the vendor on board, because that could be an issue. And then the submittals. And, I'm kind of jumping into a little bit more on level of detail, but the submittals, they should be broken into two aspects, and maybe we can talk about that more in a bit. But, we want to be able to track our submittals, because without submittals getting approved and submitted, or submitted and approved, you can't release your materials.
Yeah, let's do it as an example. So that switchgear that's 288 days, just a block of time.
Yep.
What should that look like, and why?
Yep. So if you take that 288 days, it should be dissected into, maybe 5 or 6 weeks for procurement. 5 or 6 weeks for bid and award, getting the vendor on board, and then potentially, 5 to 6 weeks for the vendor to submit the shop drawings. Yep. And then, typically we give the architects, engineers, owners like 3 weeks to review and approve the submittal. And then the remaining time, 170 days or whatever is left over, should be for the fabrication and delivery of the equipment. So those are the 4 basic steps that you should have for all major pieces of material lead time type driven issues.
And reason being is, so you now take that one slug of time and divide it into 5 distinct tasks or activities, and you can find out where the pinch point is.
Yes.
And you can see like, okay, hey, rather than we're 28 days into this, and you don't know if you're behind schedule, but if those were individual activities, oh wait, we're a week behind on submittal.
Right, ball in court. Who's holding up the process?
Yeah, so now you could see that activity could push out actually the end of the job in
Yes.
some cases, right? So now we know, okay, hey, the architect or the engineer, probably the electrical engineer, hasn't returned the submittal in the allotted time. We've just lost 3 days on our schedule.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, submittals typically take maybe 3 revs to get approved, and every time you go through that process, you could be eating away at 6 to 8 more weeks every time. And I've been on a lot of projects right now. Well, let's pick on switchgear like we just talked about. That is definitely an issue out there these days because I find the electrical designs aren't completed on projects. And then we get into the submittal process, and now the engineer is saying, oh, we need to get Eversource or we need to get National Grid involved with load studies and stuff. And, now we're having to resubmit on the switchgear. Now we find out the switchgear, well, now we have to actually increase the size of it because the load studies were never done. I mean, that's a great example of I'm running into that on numerous projects. And then to compound the issue even more, I think in our industry, we all know anything that has chips in it, anything that's electrical, the lead times are just out the window.
Yeah, and not to make it adversarial, but you got to know whose throat to choke.
Yeah. Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Did I say that right? Yeah,
Yes.
throat to choke. Yeah.
Yep.
So, yeah, we're not out there to be getting people, but you need to know the reality is if this person is holding up the job, someone needs to raise their hand and say, hey, we've got a problem here. Where's the problem? Here it is.
Yep.
But if you've just got that chunk of time, which is not the right level of detail, it's just lost in a soup.
Yep, exactly. You don't really know where you're at in the ocean.
Yeah.
And again, we're jumping forward to updates,
No.
but I mean, I think these are valid points to talk about.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
that's the procurement world.
Yeah. So you get your work breakdown structure, and we list those again. So you have procurement.
So if we start at the top, typically it's milestone key events, and usually that we're capturing what we had in the contract schedule. So underneath that section, you would normally have things like notice to proceed, start foundations, start steel erection, complete steel erection, weather tight, permanent power, and then usually you get into your occupancy turnover type milestones. There obviously you can have a variety of milestones, but the ones I just listed out are kind of atypical that you should be having in every brand new type of project schedule. So that's the milestone key event section.
Yep.
Then the next WBS or next layer would be the design. And underneath design, I am involved with a lot of projects that are GMP, guaranteed maximum price oriented, and the CMs, contractors get involved during the design development phase. So, the design's not done yet. So underneath that section, you should be capturing the major AE deliverables that are needed for you to kind of proceed with the next section, which is pre-construction. And then in pre-construction, a variety of things could be in there. It could be estimates, value engineering, permitting, different aspects of things needed to get to construction. But without getting the deliverables from the architects and engineers, you can't move through your pre-construction or your procurement, which is all needed to get to construction.
Got it. And then procurement?
And then procurement, we just spoke about. Those are having the 4 basic steps of bid and award, prep and forward, review and approve, fabricate and deliver for major packages. And maybe I'm going to pause and go back to procurement a little bit.
Yep.
So people often ask, why do I need to have procurement in my schedule? Because I'm tracking it in Prolog or
good point. Yep.
Procore or Excel. You know what I mean? So I'm tracking it there. Well, probably 99% of these companies don't have the ability to tie it back to the schedule to see what the impact is when things start going sideways on procurement. And I'm kind of jumping forward on
go for it. Yeah.
Total slack and total float. How much time do I really have before this product is going to start affecting the schedule? And most times they have to do what I call a manual reconciliation, where they look at, okay, here's when I need it in the construction schedule. Here's what my construction submittal log looks like that's in Excel or in Procore, and they're having to manually reconcile that they're having problems. Well, if you have that in the schedule to start with, it's doing it for you right there automatically.
Good point.
And I see that. And then the other thing is as well, if I'm updating Procore, if I'm updating my Excel submittal log, now I've got to update something else. I got to update the schedule too. Well, yes, because that's just the way it works.
Okay. I like that. So 5 headings: milestone key events, design, pre-con, procurement, construction.
And then one more, a very important one that we all discount and we don't give enough time to is what I call startup, checkout, closeout, turnover.
Commissioning. So
yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. My best example on that is I always kind of go back to, even though we don't talk about too much anymore, is the lead days, where we have these burn-in or building ventilation points we're trying to get on a gold.
Gas for
exactly. And, technically you're not supposed to be in the building for like 30, 60 days while this process is going on. But that has to happen in order for you to get to substantial completion. If you don't factor that into your project from day one, you're shorting yourself 2 months and you're not even aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a
big
one.
That's just a microcosm of what should be in startup and checkout. I mean, there's a variety of activities that are needed for startup of equipment, balancing. If you're in the city of Boston, there is a plethora, and I don't know if you want to talk about that right now, what the checklist is on for getting occupancies.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about it right now. It is a lot. We've kind of, maybe we have just an episode on it, but
Absolutely.
It's come up enough that
I think there's value in that, Joe, because I think a lot of contractors are unaware of what the requirements are for the bigger cities.
Yeah, the inspection and testing process. We have a kind of permitting class that covers that, but we're putting together just a specific one for basically the CO process,
Absolutely.
turnover, and the sequence of testing from the fire department, all that kind of stuff. So that's done, and I think I'm going to start rolling that out separately. But yeah, so the things you're talking about is standpipe test, generator test,
Smoke
evacuation, smoke evac, fire alarm. Did I say standpipe? Lights out. That's the generator test.
Yep.
So all those final life safety walk. Who needs to be there? What NFPA forms do you have to have filled out?
And that's all paperwork and physical stuff that has to happen, and we don't give enough time in that part of the schedule. I just see it all the time that we never include enough time at the back of the schedule. And typically what I see most companies doing is, I've got 2 years to do this project, so I schedule it out. I've got 1 month left to finish the job, and they just call it closeout, startup, 1 month in duration, and it could be a lot more than that, Joe.
Absolutely. And just you get into, you need to do a fire alarm pretest.
Yes.
And then you need to have a record of completion done by your fire alarm installer. That is a particular NFPA form. Is that thing filled out? And then at that point, you can schedule the fire department come out to do their tests. So, do you have the pretests, the associated work you need to do after the pretest doesn't work, and then pretest a second time to make sure it comes through all clear, and then schedule in the AHJ, building and fire and electrical, and pulling all those people together. And what are the costs? Because you have to pay for them to come out often on after hours to do the inspections. So
a lot of these companies, these vendors, suppliers aren't right in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, or Connecticut. They could be out in the middle of the West, could be on the West Coast. And you have to schedule these, with COVID up behind us and stuff like that. I'm seeing a lot of issues with getting these technicians out here to bump stuff to start it.
I was just about to say, a lot of times the tests, whether it's like a fire pump or a generator, they want the manufacturer out there, or you want the manufacturer out there. So are we scheduling? It's quite involved. And an interesting layer is, so the 10th edition of the building code, which will come out who knows when, they keep pushing the thing out. It's a train wreck. But long story short is they've adopted, the building code now says that you need to do integrated testing consistent with NFPA 4. So NFPA 3 and 4 are cover basically kind of commissioning of these life safety systems, and you have to test them in an integrated manner. But it talks about, similar to, there's now a third-party inspection for smoke control where there's somebody third-party watching
hired by the
install.
Owner.
Yep, hired by the owner, before, that they're looking at the ductwork before you're putting the shaft wall up. They're with that process all along.
Right.
The next edition of the code is going to say you need to do that for all your life safety systems.
Wow.
There's a third-party person that's going to do it. Here's all the forms that they should be filling out, and they should be from design to turnover.
Yep.
That they're part of the process.
Crib to cradle.
Yep. So all the more reason with this latest edition, that section of commissioning, whatever we're going to call it, startup commissioning, is going to get even more involved. So time to maybe
and there's
pay
a cost
attention.
for that.
Oh, there's a huge cost.
Yeah. And the owners need to be aware of that, which, a lot of times they might not be, and they find out maybe halfway through the project that, oh, we've got to hire this company to do this, and this, and now we're scrambling, or they're scrambling.
Yeah. So going back to, that switchgear, 280-something days, and you're saying, okay, how it should be broken out is to 5 tasks or whatever activities.
Yep.
What's the right level of detail for each activity? So, like, if you break that 5, should that 5 ever be split up? Like, can you talk a little bit about what's the right level of detail?
We walked through that. So, it's typically how long to buy out a contractor, 5 weeks for that. Submittals, depending upon what package it is.
Forgive me, I was going more towards what's the kind of appropriate duration for an activity? Should you ever have a 100-day activity?
So, kind of let's probably more direct this to construction, Joe.
Sure.
So, typically on construction activities, again, we're talking about construction, durations should not be any more than 20 to 15 working days in duration, in overall duration, Joe. And the thought process behind that is if you have a large duration activity, you're not really thinking through maybe what are all the sub-steps that really makes up. And then getting into the updating process, if you have a 60-day duration or an activity that's 15 days in duration, if I was to ask you, Joe, out in the field, how far along are you with that duration? I think you'd be much more accurate and comfortable in telling me where you're at with that 15-day duration versus the 60. The 60-day duration, you're just going to be pulling something out of the seat of your pants.
Yep.
So that's kind of the thought process behind the right level of detail on construction. And then the other one I see all the time, and it's getting better, but I still see it, is where companies have one activity that represents 5 different trade contractors.
Yep.
And let's be right up front. It's called MEP, FP, roughing or finishes, and that could be 5 guys. That could be mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and fire protection. And if you could actually take the mechanical and break it into ductwork and piping,
electrical, low voltage, control wiring.
Electrical could be 5 different guys right there.
So you never want to have multiple trades contractors under one activity.
Correct.
So if it's an automatic, if it's a different trade or a different contract, should never be smushed together.
Correct.
Shouldn't be more than 15, 20 max.
Right.
But I think a good exercise is, and obviously you don't want to schedule by the day, but for a mental exercise, if you had a framing activity and column line A to B one day, B to C the next day, and you went to, across the floor. If I asked you on any given day, are you on schedule?
Right.
At the end of the day, you're going to know.
Yes.
Nope, I'm not to column line C yet. You could with full confidence, 100% confidence, you could say whether you're on schedule or not.
So that's where divvying up the duration comes in. Absolutely. Right. Areas, column lines, levels, floors.
Phases.
Exactly.
Yep. So so you're just saying you got to look at it that way. You start stretching it out. It's 60 days. We're 3 days into framing. Are you on schedule, Joe? Yeah, we look good.
Right.
But you don't know. Is it that all the time is in the shaft wall framing, and we're doing regular 3 5/8 stud, so we're chugging along and we think we're ahead of schedule, but all the time's in the shaft wall, and you just don't have that clarity. So,
and I think why contractors don't do that, Joe, it's called accountability and responsibility. They don't want you to know where they're at because then you can nail them down.
Yep.
And I think our industry has changed a lot, especially where owners have third-party representatives on the project that are evaluating progress, and they're looking at schedules now, and it's just not a piece of paper that goes in the corner anymore. They're holding you accountable, and if you really want to be able to identify where you're at with a particular activity, it's just like you said, it's got to be more discreet.
Yeah, and no one's saying that, you're going to be up somebody's ass because one day is, hey, you're looking like you're trying to be, but like, it's just a more accurate tool to be tracking where people are. Let's not make it completely opaque on where someone's at. Let's get a good snapshot.
Yeah, I think somewhere between 5 and 20, Joe. If you get less than 5, I think it's becoming unmanageable. And I think when you get below 5 days in duration, you're looking at more like what I call 3-week look-ahead schedules that are a lot more granular that the superintendents are putting together. So there is that balance, there is that right level. So to answer your question, for construction, somewhere between 20 and 5 working days.
Yeah, and by no means was I ever saying schedule by the day, but I was, for an example, just to kind of
clarify. The only time I've ever done that is on shutdowns and outages for production facilities or power plants, where we actually schedule by the hour. That's wild. But I'm all set with that.
Yeah. Imagine the amount of activities you would have if you did it by the day. So could you talk a little bit about logic ties? I want you to talk about generally, and then I've got a couple of questions. Now, we were talking earlier about how these very specific kind of topics get a lot of traction.
Yes.
Last night, because I knew we were recording this morning, I just threw on Instagram and said, hey, I'm recording on scheduling tomorrow. Do you have any questions? And I got a boatload of questions and some great questions. Some people gave some very interesting feedback. So this episode's going to be a little different than other ones, which is we're going to have our questions, but I'm going to sprinkle in some questions from outside people while we're at it.
Interested in hearing what those are, Joe.
Yeah. So logic ties. So we've got the structure. We have the right level of detail. How are we tying these activities together? What would you say are good scheduling practices when it comes to logic ties?
Okay. So every activity is tied to another activity. So everything drives another activity. So everything is going to have a logic tie, and we'll talk about logic tie types in just a minute. The only exceptions of things that don't have logic ties, there's only 2, and this is standard practice, is the beginning of the project, which would be your notice to proceed, your letter of intent, or whatever the very first activity on the project is. And then the last activity, substantial completion or final completion, there's nothing that comes after that. Everything else has some relationship to another activity of some sort. And people say, well, why do I always have to have it always tied off? Because I should be done by that when that activity is done, I should be ready to finish the next one. Well, what happens if that doesn't play out when we do updates and say something gets pushed out in time and you don't have it tied to another activity? You're not going to push and impact the other downstream activities unless that logic tie exists. So that's the need and requirement to have a logic tie between all activities. And then again, we're not going to get into slack and float, but unless everything is tied off, those calculations won't be accurate.
So everything needs to be tied off front and back, except for the first activity, last activity.
Yes.
What are some good or common, what are the best ways to tie off? So finish to start is probably the most common. Right.
Yeah, that's the most common. That's kind of what all the softwares default to. So when one activity finishes, the next activity starts.
Yep. And then go ahead, just because we have college students that listen to this too.
Yep.
So could you explain to people what's the word where you're
lag?
Yeah. So you'd start to finish with 3-day.
Yeah.
This terrible. It's escaping my brain.
So basically, if you have things that overlap, we call that lag, and then with that lag, there's a certain amount of time that's between the start and or finish of an activity.
Yep. So frame wall, 10 days. Drywall. So when the framing is done, the drywall can start.
Which would be a finish to start.
Yep. With a -3.
So I'd kind of like to stay with good scheduling practice.
Good.
So I come from the world of Oracle and specifications where negative lags aren't allowed. But what you're referring to, Joe, is a lot of the Microsoft project classes that we've been giving that has been the suggested method for getting activities to be driven with both start, finish relationships. And in projects, you can't. You've got to use a finish to start with a negative lag. I kind of wouldn't like to go there because that's not what our industry or my scheduling planning practices allows. It has to be a positive lag. So in that instance, where you're talking about an overlap between framing and drywall, you would say start to start plus X amount of days, we can start drywall after framing starts. And then also, conversely, X amount of days after framing finishes, we can then finish hanging drywall. And, then you have to define the lag of how many days after it starts and after it finishes can we complete drywall.
Yep.
And that is scheduling 101, best practices, actually in specifications that I deal with quite often on projects. They clearly say if you have negative lags, it's reason for disapproving your schedule.
Okay, interesting.
But Bill Gates, Microsoft project, that's the only way that you can get that double logic tie relationship.
Yep.
Those that use Microsoft project know that you can only assign one type of relationship between two activities. You either have finish to start to start, or finish to finish. You can only have one of those types.
Okay. And then, again, this is for the younger folks. Could you just explain float? It's
Yes.
kind of intuitive because you've got some room for it to float in there, but how would you describe float?
So then again, what we talked about, everything has to be logically tied off so that the calculations that the software does knows how much time it takes to get from the start of the project to the end of the project, okay? And that's what we call forward pass, going through the schedule from start to end. That's forward pass. That's called the calculation for early dates, for early start, early finish. And then the opposite to that, or the second process, is called backward pass. So from the end of the project, going through the network, going through the front, that's called backwards pass, and that's for calculating your late start and your late finish. So to answer your question, what is slack or float? It's the difference typically between early finish and late finish. And if you have a completely built schedule, you will have activities with zero slack or zero float. That's your longest path, critical path through the project. But then you also have other activities that have positive float or positive slack, and those are the ones that have time that you could potentially put off without delaying the end of the project.
Yep. Okay. So you have parallel construction going on, or parallel tracks through the schedule.
You could have multiple, depending on the
Yeah.
size of the project. You could have one or two, or you could have 60.
So one of the questions we got in said, really talk about start to finish and finish to start. And basically, why would you ever use a
Right.
start to finish?
So we talked about finish to start. We talked about start to start. We talked about finish to finish. We didn't talk about start to finish. And I typically tell people that is a fourth choice that you can have, but I don't think it should be used. And I'm going to show why in just a second on a whiteboard as to how it's used and what the pros and the cons are.
Yeah, because it's just to slow down so people can get their mind around it. So they're saying when one activity starts, the next activity, the tied activity can finish, which is
So a start to finish?
yeah.
So really what it's saying is when this activity starts, the activity prior to it can finish. So that's where the start to finish comes in. It's kind of like backwards pass scheduling. It's not a good tool for a real CPM schedule, but there is goods and bads with using those ties.
Okay. Do you want to give
Yeah,
it a whirl?
absolutely. Yep.
So I'm going to keep talking while Scott's getting set up.
Okay.
But So for the first time, for people, if you're listening, you probably want to hop over to YouTube and watch this. We're going to do a whiteboard session. I told Scott it feels like we're in the 1970s on PBS, and we're up there with a flip chart. But go ahead, Scott.
All
I'll
right,
hand it over to you.
my world's all schedules start on paper to some degree. So to answer the question about the start to finish relationship, the best one I can use is, let's say that we have erect structural steel. This is the activity itself. And then we have another activity here called deliver steel. The question that came in from the person was, so how do you use a start to finish relationship? So in this instance, this is called start to finish, meaning when this activity here starts, this one can finish. So what it's really doing, it's telling you, when do I need to have materials on the project? In this case, it's delivery of steel is driven by the start date of steel. And so this is a great tool. On a lot of companies that I've been with, we refer to this as an ROJ, or required on job. And it's a great tool that you can use to come up with milestones for major deliveries of materials. But my argument is, what should really be driving the delivery of the steel, Joe?
Probably approved submittals.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we talked about just a minute ago, and I'm just going to kind of do a simple version of this. These are the 4 steps. This is the bid and award.
Nice and loud.
This is prep and forward submittal, review and approve submittal, and then fabricate and delivery. That's what should really be driving this milestone right here. Not this relationship here, but the series of these activities. Because like what we just talked about a minute ago was that submittals don't always go well, and there's redesign issues that go on, and because of that, the delivery of steel could get pushed out in time. And unless you have these series of activities tied to the delivery of steel, you won't know that you have a problem. The only way you're going to know you have a problem is if you leave it like it is, and then you look in your submittal registry and you see that, oh, my delivery of steel is out to this date, and it's now going beyond when I need it on site. You're doing a manual reconciliation. I call it guerrilla math, Joe. Mm-hmm. Why do that? I mean, you should let the software do that for you.
Yeah, so what's happening, I'm thinking the people that are using that start to finish are saying, I'm building out my construction schedule. I'm ignoring the procurement side of things. I know I need to start erection on this day, so I am going to do a start to finish. So when I start erecting steel, I should be finishing having steel show up on site. And they're working that backwards. But back to the original conversation around work breakdown structure, you can't be leaving out procurement because there's all this stuff that you just wrote on the board leading up to that point, and you're never going to know if that's faltering somewhere in the process. At step 2, it's been hung up, and there's 5 steps to it. You have no idea if your only tie is, I'm erecting steel on this day. Yep. On Wednesday, I want steel here on Tuesday.
I think the only time that I would ever recommend using that is in that contract schedule, Joe, where we talked about it just being an eye candy, a 3-page high-level schedule of here's how the project should go. I think having that kind of application is okay, but when you get into your true execution baseline schedule that you're going to live and die by, you need to get rid of this and you need to convert over to the 4 steps of procurement.
Got it. Excellent. So start to finish, don't use it.
My bottom line, yes.
Awesome. There's a second question that's kind of in a similar vein here, and I like this whiteboard session. I think we might try and incorporate this a little more, and we're not going to have it such a bootleg where we're taped a what would you call it? Giant Post-it note on the.
I'm always for whiteboard exercises. I think illustrations are a lot. There's a lot of meaning behind them because when people see something visually, I think it comes to light a lot quicker than just talking about it.
Yeah, no, it's great. So the next question, kind of similar, is what's more responsible, showing the fabrication and delivery of an item as late as possible, or finish to start from its release?
So I assume what this person is asking about is specifically having a late as possible, what we call constraint on the fabricate and delivery activity and not the procurement. So the typical usage of that, Joe, is so we go and we buy out a contract, we get the submittals in, we get them approved, and then technically the fabricate and delivery should happen after the approval, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what people, what they like to see is that, okay, well, I'm not going to release that material as soon as I get an approval. I want to kind of push it off out in time because I want it to look like, we're not actually starting to fabricate and deliver that, or the delivery is not going to be on this date because it's way, way, way early. So in the software, you can actually apply what's called a as late as possible constraint, and it will take like when we talked about here on structural steel, it will take this fabricate and delivery and move it all the way out to when you actually need it for the installation. So you could have a gap between the approval process and then the actual start of fabricate and delivery.
And can I ask a question?
Yes.
Just also because I was trying to turn my computer around so forgive me if you already said this. Would the goal there be because you don't want to be sitting on material and trying to leave it in storage, or why would you want to push that out as far as possible?
That's a valid point. So, when you store materials, there's a cost for that, right? I think people, it's more of a visual thing that when they look at a schedule and they see that, okay, fabricate and delivery of steel is going to show up on this date, but we don't need it for like 2 or 3 months later, I'd like to push that delivery right out to when I actually need it. So that would be the instance of using as late as possible constraint. My thing is, I'd rather show it being released for fabrication, and then maybe putting in a date of when it's actually going to be needed by, or you just let that duration of time go out and you use total slack and total float to help manage how much time do I have left before it's going to become a problem, or how much time do I have until I need to tell the vendor, okay, we have only a couple more weeks left. Are we going to hit this date? I'm not a real proponent of late as possible. I know a lot of companies like to use that. It helps kind of illustrate visually that the materials aren't going to be there until this X date. Especially with procurement, I think we should be driving procurement, especially fabricated and deliveries, as hard as possible, because I always see things slipping out in time, Joe, and I think you might be shorting yourself or creating potential problems by pushing it out as late as possible. Again, I think it's more of a visualization thing that the person is asking about, in the bar chart.
Yep. Okay, great. So we're doing good. We've got the work breakdown structure, what the right level of detail is. Talked a little bit about logic ties. That's tough because it's a very visual thing. End date.
Yes.
What do you have to say about end dates?
So let's face it, guys. We don't have all the time in the world to finish a project, do we? I mean, we have a contract, and the contract is a date that we have to finish by for substantial or final completion. What I find a lot of people doing in the baselines is not necessarily nailing down with a constraint. Again, this is more software kind of application, is nailing down in the software, when do you have to be done by? What's my drop dead date, Joe, for substantial and final completion? And so we always, we build the baseline schedule, and it comes out to that contract date that we own. And, that's good for the baseline. But then again, everything we kind of talk about so far today really comes into play when we go to do updates. So the thought process is, or the actual instance is when we go to do updates, and let's face it, schedules are dynamic, and we don't always make plan like we talk about, and that's what updating is all about, is when we start pushing out our critical path because of whatever issues are going on, progress issues, change management, which we're going to talk about in a minute, COVID supply chain issues, which are still going on, unforeseen conditions, more change management issues. When we start pushing those activities out and we start pushing out the end date, Joe, we want to be able to show what's happening to the slack. So if we're pushing the end date out, our slack should be going negative. But if we don't assign a bookend to those milestones, the end date's going to go out, and then the slack is still going to stay at 0, and you're just going to have to do a manual reconciliation between, okay, here's what I have in my contract schedule, but I'm 2 months out from that contract date. In your head, you know you're 2 months late, but the total slack's not showing it that way. So it's more of a software application, good practice.
So it's not that they're not going in with an end date. They have an end date in mind. It's just you're just saying they're not from a software standpoint. They're not locking it in. So that is pinned.
Yes.
No matter what you do, that can't move. So if you're fucking 6 weeks behind because something screwed up, you should be showing 6 weeks negative float on some path through the job site.
Yep.
Okay, through the job site, through the schedule itself, through the CPM.
Absolutely, Joe, for whatever reason that might be.
Okay. We talked about procurement. We talked about end dates. Where else do you see companies making mistakes with scheduling? Is there anything else, or did we cover?
Well, we talked about durations, right? Right level of detail. We talked about the 5 different buckets of work breakdown structures, and in my particular, the one is procurement. And I'm just going to kind of just go over that one last time. So as far as procurement, you don't have to have every nut, bolt, and washer in the schedule, but my rule of thumb is there's 3 different criteria for having it. So the first one is materials that have early needs, Joe. What are early needs? So that would be like rebar, concrete mix, maybe if you have some crazy masonry products. Hollow metal frames, those are always a problem. We need them early on jobs for framing. So those would be examples of early needs. And then the second one would be kind of long lead items. And that's, in the last 3 years with COVID, it's like what doesn't have a long lead these days. So you got to be kind of judgmental on that. But anything that has something where over at least maybe, 50 to 60 days in duration for fabrication and delivery time, I think you should be capturing those in there because those could be potential problems. And then the last one is, I think we've talked about this in a couple classes. We call it about the delegated design or design intent issue where the best example is like on fire protection systems, from day one in our industry, the contractors own the design on that. The sprinkler contractors do. Here's the coverage, and then they go in, they do the piping layouts and the calculations. But what I'm finding is that the engineers and architects are starting to indirectly have the other trade contractors do that, right? So curtain wall contractors, facade contractors, mechanical contractors, and, they're not telling them in the specifications that that's a design build, design intent, a delegated design. And where I'm trying to go with this is if they don't know about that and they start submitting on product, Joe, and it comes back, revise and resubmit because you don't have these calculations or you didn't figure out these loads, that should have been figured out by the architect and the engineer. And where I'm going with this, that could take multiple review cycles and eat up time, and now before we know it, we're negative. So that's the third bucket of why we should have procurement in the schedule.
Great.
But I find that one there to be probably definitely one of the problematic items. And the other one is, don't know if you want to talk about it right now, is and I think somebody called in or they emailed you with change management and how to deal with that and what's the pros and the cons.
Yeah, let me find that one.
But I find that to be another problematic mistake by companies.
Yeah, where did that one go? Okay, yeah, here we go. So sometimes we have delays or an RFI bulletin that impacts either immediately or down the line, and we realize it's an impact. Lots of people are hesitant to put fragnets or impact schedules together, work breakdown structure to include these things. Then owners, reps, design teams get defensive, may think you're trying to start a claim. What's the right thing there? How do we have the conversation of just keeping an eye on this? So change happens. You would build out a fragnet or a subnet. You want to explain what a fragnet or subnet?
So we talked about the 5 buckets already in the project, right? Milestones, procurement, pre-construction. construction. So once you get into issues that are causing time impacts, Joe, we actually create another work breakdown structure in the industry. I've been using this for a long, long time now. I call it change management.
Mm-hmm.
And then underneath of that, you would then have the different issues that you're running into. Unforeseen conditions, maybe the owners change some material types in the project, and that's where you capture what they refer to as a fragnet. Basically, a fragnet is a series of activities that represent the change process. And I'm just going to kind of go through it quickly, Joe, with the change management, typically what it is.
Yeah, and just I'm probably good because I don't ever schedule. The last time I scheduled was when I was in college. Actually, when I was a super, I do 2-week, 3 weeks ahead or whatever. But manhole's supposed to go in one location. You go to dig, there's a duct bank in the way.
Good example.
Now we got to relocate the manhole.
Or the duct bank.
Yep. Right? That is not in our schedule. So a subnet or a fragnet will be taking that issue and creating its own little sub-schedule that pulls in procurement, pulls in design,
could have multiple facets to it.
Yep. So that way all of this information is getting tracked, because it might be that the end result is, we moved the manhole 4 feet to the right. You get to the end of the job and you're 3 weeks behind, and they're like, it's because we had to relocate that manhole. They say, you just moved the thing 4 feet over to the right.
Right.
And there's nowhere in the schedule, if you don't have a fragnet, that is showing, what really happened there. Okay, we sent the RFI to the design team. They sat on it for 6 weeks. We got drawings back. Those drawings didn't work out with what was in the field, and it ended up taking 4 months to move that thing.
Well, Joe, you got to think about a proposal too. This could be additional work.
Yep, proposal, to get that proposal approved. There's all that time. So that manhole that you just, quotes showing for people listening, just moved 4 feet to the right. We lost 4 months. The fact that we're only 3 weeks late, you should be carrying us on your shoulders down the street and have a parade for us.
Right.
But if you get to the finish line and that wasn't documented along the way, it just becomes, you move the thing 4 feet to the right. What do you mean it slowed down the job 3 weeks?
I think what the person's worried about is, I call it the honeymoon between the owner and the contractor, Joe. If you start putting this stuff in the schedule, are you starting to try to, create a situation where you're going to go after the owner for a claim and stuff? And I think the easiest way to deal with that, Joe, is put in the detail that you just described, right, in your schedule. And then if you don't want to show it to the owner, at least roll it up, okay? But at least forensically, you have it in there. And if you need that information at a later time to go after a claim, it's in there. Or if you do want to show it, which I think you should, because I think schedule should be a team tool, and you're showing the team how you're being impacted, I think you should be showing that information, because I would go to a meeting and say, okay, well, here's our issue. How can we work as a team? This is where that whole partnering comes in. How can we quicken up this resolution process so it's not a problem anymore?
Yeah, and maybe the quote that was put in here is, trying to say, hey, we're not looking to start a claim. We're just trying to keep an eye on this, quote.
Right.
Maybe less of keep an eye on it and say, we're just trying to manage this. This change that's the conversation to the owner might be, this change has 37 activities in it. If we don't put this in, we're going to lose control of that. And then right now it's not going to impact the job. But if we lose track of it, then we're looking at some real implications. So we have to, if you want us to manage a job, we need to do this.
Well, Joe, remember we talked about earlier about the switchgear at 288 days. It's one activity.
Yep.
Same example. I see a lot of companies do some change management. They have one activity in there called resolve stormwater duct bank issue. It's like 60 days in duration. How do you know where you're at with that process?
And that 60s was probably just pulled out of the air, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so you think it's just relaying the information that we've been talking about to date, like, hey, we need to manage this. In order to manage it, we need to have the right activities, the right, what do you like to call them, right level of detail,
Yep.
and right logic ties. We need to have this all buttoned up and shown, and that way we know, is it the design team that's holding us up? Is
Right.
it, is it the subcontractor?
Owner
And-
signing off on the proposal.
Yep. And
Yep.
so we're trying to manage your project. In order to manage your project, we have to schedule it properly.
And not every issue, Joe, do we have to do that in the schedule, but the ones that my criteria, like I talked about in procurement, those that are definitely pushing the end date should be in there, Joe. And then any issues that you think might be in the near term pushing the end date because you know it's not going to get resolved that quickly, but you're hoping that it does, you should factor those in as well.
Excellent. All right. We had a few questions around a similar theme. So I'm gonna pin them down to one, and a lot of them gave a tremendous level of detail, which was nice. But roughly speaking, they were all along this lines, which is we've had a few meetings lately where we've been hearing that this project was supposed to start this year, but has been stuck in the pre-construction phase. So I'm curious to see how that impacts schedules and how GCs are dealing with this. So a lot of people had that question, basically saying, hey, my job is being pushed, or what happens when the owner says, get me a permit, but I'm not ready to start. Like, what is the impacts of on cost, time, a schedule when the owner pumps the brakes and says, okay, we're going to start next year,
Yeah. I mean,
or 2 years from now?
so we'll talk schedule time for probably first. So, I mean, obviously, I would hope that the owner realizes that if they're pushing off a project, that they're not going to be able to hold the end date that they originally signed the contractor up to. I mean, I've been on some projects where there has been that expectation. I suppose if it's only a month or so, maybe, if it's a GMP negotiated project, maybe you're able to absorb that or deal with that, Joe. But, if it's a hard bid lump sum project,
The end date's moving.
it's a day-for-day push, Joe, as far as the end date, as far as I'm concerned. So that would be the schedule time piece. And then as far as the cost piece, kind of, again, the thing I always like to talk about is procurement, Joe. So, when you have a project and even subcontractors, I'm going to talk about at their levels, they've bid the job for you, and now that job's getting pushed out. And let's talk about switchgear again. Let's say that Eaton or GE or Siemens had you in a particular window of production for your gear, your motor control centers, and now you call them up and said, okay, I can't commit to the order. I'm going to have to push it off. They're going to say, well, Joe, I'm sorry, but tell me when you're ready to go, and I'll put you into the production window. And that could be a huge hit right there. And nobody ever thinks about materials being an issue when a job gets pushed off, but it's all about production windows these days. And even when you're on schedule or in a production window, getting your materials are a problem. Now you push it off a year, it could be a best guess, and that could be a significant critical path issue for you on your project. So that's the procurement issue that I see.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you're looking at an impact to the schedule end date because you've now affected the critical path because of a vendor. You don't the last place your mind goes is a vendor when you're saying, okay, hey, we're going to start later.
Right.
You're thinking about subcontractor,
Bricks
manpower,
and mortar,
all that
just
other
getting
stuff,
the job
right?
going. Yep.
But yeah, it's a great point. Like they have a capacity. Okay, our facility can build 10 air handlers at a time, and you were one of those 10 at this moment because this is when you wanted it. In a year from now, that slug might not be
Structural steel is
open.
another good example. You buy the tonnage of steel and they have it allocated for your project. Well, I'm not going to let the steel sit around. I'm going to give it to the next guy.
Yep. And
The other thing too with that, Joe, is material cost escalation.
So just inflation escalation,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Inflation escalation.
yeah.
How about from a subcontractor standpoint?
So more from a manpower resource issue.
Or anyway,
Yeah. So there's twofold on that. So the first one again is if you've got a company signed up to do a project and now you're pushing them off, these other companies aren't sitting on the bench waiting for your job, Joe. They've got 3 other jobs going on. They have maybe 3 or 4 backlog that are going to be starting up shortly, and now you're asking to take the job that you should have been working on now and pushing it into, their future work, and that raises a lot of questions. Can the contractor have that many jobs going on concurrently? Again, subcontractors, do they have the manpower to deal with that? That's a huge issue that needs to be vetted out with people that you've signed up for the project that are now being postponed. So not only is the GCCM getting pushed out, but all of his potential awards to his subs and vendors are.
Yeah, I've heard you say in the past that you should basically be holistically reviewing whoever you had for a subcontractor to say, are they still the right person to do this job?
Absolutely. Almost bring them in and do another pre-bid interview, Joe.
Yeah, because that's funny. It ties to that recent procurement episode around what they do to decide, pre-qualify, bid level, because part of that conversation is, hey, how much work do they have going on right now? Well, that analysis is completely gone. Were they a problem on another job? In that year, they become a problem on another job.
Yep.
Now they're not the right fit, where you're like, absolutely not. They were a train wreck on this last job. What are you doing about renegotiating that? And then you also brought up a good point about wages even, right?
Yeah, we haven't even touched on that. So, I mean, the last thing on the resources is, a lot of companies that say, oh, yeah, I can take care of you, Joe. And then when they get to do the job, now it's a problem. And that's where a lot of subcontractors either go out of business, or the contractor has to supplement the subcontractor's resources with additional bodies. And there's money associated with that.
But why is that tied to being pushed? I'm missing the connection.
Well, so if you keep the same subcontractor in your job and he's saying, oh, yeah, I can do that job too with the other 6 jobs I'm going on, and he's not really telling you
They're
the truth.
They're just too taxed, yeah. So you've shifted the schedule. They had everything lined up where I usually run 50 people. I'm going to have my 25 with you, 25 on another job for the next year, and then this other one starts, and they've kind of got their manpower leveled.
Correct.
Now you've pulled that out and pushed it to another point in time. It's just stacked with too many other jobs. It gets out of control. They can't manage things.
Let's face it, Joe, resources are a problem even when things are on track.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
And then you add that into the mix, that's
time.
just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. And then there's just wage increases.
Yes.
So whether it's they're a union subcontractor and the contract says, next year they go up 2.5%, and the year after they go up 3%. Now you've gone up 5.5% over 2 years, and those are real wages. When you have hundreds of people on the job,
Yep.
probably thousands at some point, that's major dollars. So you've got the resource loading from manpower standpoint, from material standpoint, wage increases, your production availability from vendors, straight just general inflation that goes on. And the reality is that the end date's going to move.
Yep. And I've got one job that I'm it's not because the owner pushed it off, it's because it changed management, and the job's about 1.5 years late. And the company that I'm dealing with is 2 of the key people on the projects are getting ready to retire.
Ooh.
And now this company has to come up with a transition plan to bring new staff on to deal with that. I know it's not related to pushing a job off from a start, but it's the same idea.
No, but that's funny. Go back to the procurement episode. One of the things they were saying is when they're doing this plus delta on who's going to be the right sub, they're going to say, okay, we'll use XYZ drywall, but Scott has to be the foreman on it. Because we've worked with him in the past, and this is a sophisticated job. You can't just have any foreman on this.
A facility that he's worked on before, and we want him back.
Yeah, all of that kind of thing. Well, in a year from now, Scott might not be available.
Yep.
So, yeah, key personnel. Key personnel is probably another big one, whether it's retirement or scheduling.
Right.
That's a very good point, Scott. I like that. Key personnel. I might try and make a little piece of content out of all the.
Well,
on
a lot of jobs, they're giving you the award based upon Team A, right? And if the owner's not getting Team A and Team B shows up, that could be an issue.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about subcontractors. The GC might not be
Right.
able to.
Well, that's kind of what I was talking about.
Yeah. No, you just triggered it when in my mind when
And
you
the
said
worst
that.
case scenario, Joe, is, and I've seen a couple of these, is where the GCCM gets back to the owner and says, okay, because you're pushing the job off, here's the cost increase. And sometimes the owner will say, all right, we're going to terminate and we're going to go back out to bid. And they go back out to bid, and the owner thought they could get a better price, and whether they do or not, but typically 9 times out of 10, everybody else's prices have gone up as well, and then the owner's like, what do I do now?
Yeah. I mean, I had one of the examples that came in with these questions because I asked for a little more clarity because there was a bunch of stuff that came in around that same question. What happens when these jobs are getting pushed?
Yeah.
Because people are seeing that in the market right now. One of the things was that there was a project that was originally priced at, I'll use rough numbers, but it was this scale at around 200 and low 200s for 200 million
Yep.
for a project. And now because the project kept getting pushed, it's now broken 400 million. And it is almost
What kind of time frame was that? Like a year push?
it was more than a year.
Yeah.
But like
Well, look what the housing market's
yeah.
done, Joe. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like nothing's getting cheaper.
yeah. So I mean that's to more than double
Yep.
or double a project is crazy.
I guess in some instances, depending upon what the facility's all about, that could be almost where the owner decides not to build.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh,
if
absolutely.
it's that drastic.
Yeah, it's going to. And now, we do a lot of talking about NFPA 241, and there's a lot of stuff. If you're doing wood frame, that this code change that went into effect could shelve a project.
Is this like the podiums that we deal with, like the 6 stories of wood?
Yeah. They're now requiring for those what they call large wood frames. So not even necessarily just tall, but once you get to a certain massing,
Square footage?
it's a combination of square footage and stories.
Yep.
Right. So if you're much wider, you can be lower and you still trigger a large frame.
Yep.
If you're small footprint and you're tall, you'll trigger it too. So there's height and area requirements to be defined as large wood frame.
Yep.
But if you're defined as large wood frame, which is most of these podiums
Yep.
that are being built, you need a fire exposure analysis that could trigger the need for sprinklers. There is
Sprinklers, like permanent sprinkler installations.
as construction goes on.
Oh, so this is like preventative fire protection as the building's going up. Because, I mean, how many jobs have we seen that have caught fire, Joe? I mean, I don't know how many. There's been a couple of them, but yeah.
Yeah, last week 3 people died
Wow.
on a construction site fire. The spray foam. I think it was a spray foam
Yep.
caught on fire. So, but long story short is that's a huge cost implication. It also says right now, if you read it literally, that you need to have a person on site,
Fire watch?
security person on site 24/7 once the combustible construction's on site. You're paying a security guard
Right.
second and third shift for 5 days, and then 3 shifts Saturday, Sunday for
Oh, he's got to be there full time.
full time.
Wow.
I had one person come back and said, we're looking at a project because NFPA 241 went into effect during the process. They're looking at a $600,000 difference in price.
Wow.
So something like that. So code changes could happen during that thing. You push it off the energy code that just went into effect. We're looking at the 10th edition that's going to go into effect. You might want to get this thing permitted and going before
Right.
before these things take
Is
effect.
this part of the zero carbon footprint initiative?
That's
Part of it?
that's some of it for sure.
Yep.
I'm going to make a note here because I think this is something we can dig in more on.
It'd be interesting, with the whole wood framed, because that's kind of what been the last 8 to 10 years. You wonder if steel or light frame, light gauge,
Framing, yeah.
light gauge, but heavy gauge
Metal stuff.
framing. It starts coming. I've seen it coming up, and I'm wondering if the offset is to get rid of that. You go back to that.
Yeah, and because one of the other things in that new edition is that you need to enclose the stairway as the building goes up.
Is that like an area of refuge?
Kind of,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
You
yeah.
basically don't want you want the fire department to be able to get in and out and have an enclosure that they can.
Full standpipe and a place to go up and down.
Yep.
Wow.
So, and they say once the exterior walls are constructed, the stairs have to be enclosed on that floor. So as you put the exterior wall in, you've got to close in your stairs.
What do you mean that? Be like siding and windows?
Well, so that's one of the things I'm part of this group, and
Questionable.
we're working on trying to get clarification on it.
Define it.
Yeah, because it just says when the exterior walls are erected or something like that. So does that mean the windows are in? Does that mean it's been sided? Like
Right.
it just says exterior walls.
Kind of gray.
It's gray.
Yep.
So we're working on trying to get that figured out. But those are all things that can be affected by pushing off start dates. And then another question that came in that's kind of I'm lumping it into this family of this type of question, which is, are vendors locking in prices and for how long? So getting back to our conversation about switchgear or whatever we're ordering,
Mm-hmm.
I know this isn't your world, but are you getting a sense of, from a cost perspective, how long vendors are willing to
Commit to?
Yeah.
I mean, up until recently, I was hearing between 10 to 30 days, and that's
Yeah, I
it.
was going to say I've heard
Yep,
30.
yep.
Yeah. So
Depending upon what the material is, it's getting a little bit better, but that's kind of out of my wheelhouse. It's more of a subcontractor vendor question that I don't really get too much involved with, but I've heard between 10 to 30 days.
yeah, I've heard similar, so
Yeah.
that must be right. But that's a pretty short window. This
Yes,
price is good for 30 days, even that short,
Right.
and that's the long end.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question here. Are more GCs involving subs when building schedules, or are they still working in a vacuum?
Good question. I would
Very good
say
question.
that from the projects that I'm involved with, it's probably a 50-50 mix, Joe, meaning that 50% of the contractors are kind of, developing the schedules on their own. They're putting the right level of detail in there, and then on their own. And then the others are actually involving the subcontractors, vendors. During the baseline schedule, they'll call them for information on, how long should we be planning for different activities? What should the durations be? What's your workflow? But, it depends upon what kind of project you're on. If you're on a hard bid lump sum job, that information's hard to get out of the contractors. And, a lot of times some of these guys aren't on board right away, Joe, because you're not buying everybody out right away, even though you should be. I always tell, project management 101 is you should be buying out everybody as soon as possible so you know what your buy is on the job, and then you can get submittals going. But for whatever reason, a lot of companies kind of postpone buyout for whatever reason. So getting vendors and subs involved is more on the GMP negotiated private work where those contractors are involved early in on the job, Joe, and that and they're more willing to give you information. So I think the 50-50 mix for me is the 50% is the municipal lump sum bid jobs. They're not really getting the subs vendors involved. And then the other 50 mix is the private GMP mix, where it's more of a happy environment between the contractors, subs, and the vendors, where they're actually bringing the subs in. And, in this thing we've called, in the last 10 years, pull planning or lean planning, even though I've been doing that for almost 30 years, it's just getting people involved with detail level and scheduling. And, it's like the whiteboard that we did here on the relationship with start to finish is, doing that on a much more granular level with the contractors, and actually having a conference room where they all get together and plan together about who comes first, who comes next, who can overlap with who, and how long the durations are. Again, that's the other 50%.
Okay. And now, so I get it. It depends, and it varies from contractor to contractor as well. I'm sure some people are
type of
better.
project.
Yeah, if it's a tenant fit out versus a ground up. So there's
Yep.
that. The answer really is it depends. But with that said, I guess with the contractors that you've seen over the years, is it happening more often than it did in the past? Less in the past? Like, are we getting better at it? Because I think that's
I think
really
we're getting better at it.
the core of his question, I think.
And the thing with it, and I don't want to make it sound like we're trying to beat people up, but you can hold the subcontractor accountable now. If he gives you a duration in logic and he's not performing on the job, Joe, according to what he told you, you can go back to that and, say, hey, listen, you said you're going to have 3 guys here and it was going to take you, X amount of days to do this, this, and this. And now he's not making that happen. I mean, not that we want to use that as a ammunition,
Yep.
yeah. But I mean, I'm all for team buy-in, Joe. It's a team effort. So, if you get collaboration, you're working together as a team instead of it being a schedule that's just by the contractor and the subs had no input on it. But, that's the hard bid lump sum world where, the subs are just, here's your schedule and you got to make it happen. Well, that's not the way I bid the job.
Yeah.
That's there's it's a double-edged sword. And a lot of times some contractors don't even give schedules out. They keep them internal and they give them to owners only.
Really?
Yeah. The only thing subcontractors and vendors might see on some instances are look-ahead schedules by the superintendent for 3 or 4 weeks out, and that's it.
That's wild.
Yep.
Not even part of their contract.
So that's another good question. So what do they have for a contract document relative to a schedule? It could be a simple 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with 5 or 6 major milestones. That's it.
Yep. Wow.
Yep. But I'm seeing more and more where contractors are including more detailed schedules with their subcontracts, but more times than less, especially on hard bid lump sum job, that they've got, okay, here's your 3 milestones that you got to hit. How you get there is up to you.
Okay. So last question here. Now this one was a little tongue-in-cheek. The first question that came in was, why do they never work? Because I asked, what's your question about scheduling that you have? And they responded with, why do they never work? I think half joking.
Right.
And then they did follow up and he said, no matter how much input I give to ours, they never end up working. And I think that probably means finishing on time, changing order. Like, I know this is kind of a meta question, a really big question, but why don't schedules work?
Well, they're dynamic, Joe. Meaning that, again, so we have a baseline schedule that we're trying to meet, but then we do updates, and we should be doing updates at least on a bi-weekly or bi-monthly, whatever, every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, at least at the end of each month, like the requisition, we should be doing an update. Well, during the update process, performance is either good or bad. Procurement issues might get better or worse. And we might run into change management issues that could further influence the project, typically for the worse. And that's why schedules, I don't say they don't work, they're dynamic. They come in and they go out every month. It's not uncommon for 1 month to be on schedule, the next month to be off schedule, and then the following month maybe things are going stellar and you're ahead of plan. Most of the time I'm trying to maintain plan or I keep going further out in time. I've been on very few jobs where the job's complete early.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's almost, to use a sports analogy, you go in with a game plan, but if the plan is all around Scott running the football all the time and we occasionally throw off play action and Scott breaks his ankle, well, you're not going to do that anymore. We need to change the plan.
Right. Or let's say it was based upon sunny skies and now all of a sudden it's raining and snowing.
Yeah.
That plan's pretty much modified and it's not going to work and you're going to have to change it up a bit.
Yep. But it doesn't mean that you don't have a plan going in.
Correct.
Right? Same way if you're going to drive across the country, you might want to know where you're going to go. You wouldn't just go out there with a compass and start, hey, I'll head in this direction and I'll get to California.
Yep.
Right? You might get to a point where, okay, the road's closed, we get a detour and we'll go that way and that's fine. But yeah, the point is it's dynamic.
So what was a motto I heard was plan the work and then work the plan.
Yep. And it doesn't mean that plan can't change.
Correct. No, it's and on top of that, the one thing I run into time and time again is okay, here's our original plan, Joe. And now we've gotten into the job and we've all gotten smarter. We know more about the job. And sometimes the way we originally built the job, Joe, we've got to modify it slightly, either workflow-wise or adding more detail in there that we really didn't know about. And, I hear this all the time from the other side usually as well. You guys are professional experts. You should have factored that in from day one. That's not reality, Joe. When we go and we put schedules together, you know, we usually do a pretty good deep dive into the detail. And, you know, in some instances, we might have not just read the drawings in enough detail. A lot of times we didn't get vendor information, and now we need to reflect that in the schedule. And, you know, a lot of people don't like to hear that, but that's the way it is.
Or frankly, the information wasn't in the design documents.
Yeah, that's
right.
That's
like,
yeah, that's a whole different aspect. Yeah. Yes.
So, all right. Last question, and I should have given you a heads up that I was going to ask this. But this is what I'm
always ready for impromptu.
This is what I ask everybody, and this does not have to be about scheduling. This is just about kind of what you see in the industry. What do you think over the next 2, 5, 10 years? You pick, just kind of where we're going. What do you think we'll see more of, and what do you think we'll see less of? You can answer them both. You can just pick one. But where do you see what do you see for the future in construction?
Well, there's been this issue about logic ties, Joe, and back, I'm going to go date myself, back in 1984 when I started out in the industry. We had, I'm kind of digressing a little bit, but I think a lot of the older audience that might be listening to this eventually will appreciate it. It was called precedence diagramming. I'm sorry, it was actually called arrow diagramming. And you could only have one type of relationship, a finish to start relationship. You couldn't have any of those other three that we talked about. So what that forced us to do back in the day was plan down to almost like 5 and 10 day durations because you couldn't overlap activities.
Okay, makes sense.
And in the legal community and the claims community, they say that now that we have these relationships that have overlaps, they're really not, they're overused or misused, and that a lot of people would like to see us get back to the basics, back to like the 80s, Joe, where you were forced to really think things out in a very linear fashion, which is going to create the schedules to get huge. Whether we go there or not, that's up for debate, but a lot of people are thinking that's one thing that we need to change back to, Joe.
Interesting.
The other thing I think, at least I hope, is that procurement becomes more and more integrated into our schedules, and it would be really super to see if companies, I'm sure they're out there, but more companies could offer a solution of linking Procore, Excel logs back to the schedule so they talk to each other, so that, because that's the excuse I always hear about having procurement and schedules. I've already got it in something else. I'm tracking it there. Well, if they somehow could link them live, Joe, that would be awesome. I know there are some companies that are doing that, but it's like 1% of 100.
Yeah. Okay.
And I just think schedules are going to become more and more important because I think deliveries on end dates of projects are becoming more aggressive, Joe, and everybody needs to know where the problem areas are and why.
Nice. Okay. Thank you, Scott.
Yep. Thank you, Joe.
And per, how should I say this? So Scott does a lot of education for me. So I appreciate you doing that. It's great. You know, we've had some discussion around executive summaries, which maybe we can talk about another time because we're getting a little long in the tooth on this one. But
the whole reporting and dashboards.
Yeah, the monthly reports. You know, you and I have worked on kind of a little bit of a template that I've sat on for too long. I might kind of share that.
My only note would be, Joe, and we won't go into it too much, is you have a schedule. I think that a simple document needs to accompany the schedule every month that kind of outlines your goals, objectives, hardships, impacts, problems, and in areas that can be expedited. That would be kind of my only message, and obviously we can talk a lot more about that, Joe, but that would be my message about further reporting and executive reports.
Yeah, I'll actually open it up. I think I have it here, and let's just see what we had for...
Because, you know, not everybody wants to read a 30, 40-page schedule. They'd rather be able to go to a single-page document that kind of, you know, shows the owner, shows the reader, you know, how are they doing on the projects, you know, and here's some explanation as to what some of the problems are and you know, how can we deal with it. I think it's important, and I think that's probably one of the things you asked me, Joe, about where companies making mistakes. I think that's one of them. I don't want to call it a mistake, but I think it's something that should be definitely thought about.
So it's a gap. It's something that
Yes,
a place where they could place where they could improve. Not
yes.
necessarily that they're doing it wrong, but that they where they could get better.
Yes.
So, the one that we kind of collectively stuck together had, I heard a lot of feedback from contractors like, well, there's going to be an owner that wants just a one sheet thing. What's the
dashboard.
What's the dashboard, right?
Yep.
And got a dashboard here that's just green, yellow, red.
Yep.
Schedule.
I call it the stoplight.
There you go.
Yep.
Schedule, buyout, contingency, safety, compliance. So you can look, what's the health of all those things? And then there's an accompanying document that goes into a greater level of detail and say, okay, this is red, contingency's red. Let me go to the section on contingency.
Yes.
And then we dropped in schedule that's showing milestones, any unforeseen conditions that came across, RFIs of note.
So you can drill down and figure out what the root issues are or why.
Yep. Submittals of notes, and then kind of a project summary, what the current critical path is. And that's interesting, right? Because somebody says, well, the critical path is the critical path. But as we talked about, it's dynamic. So that critical path could be changing. So someone might be for 3 months looking at that the steel is our critical path.
Yep.
And then the next job meeting, they go into, oh, wait, the steel isn't the critical path anymore.
It's switchgear.
Or air handles or whatever.
Yep.
Oh, geez, okay, where do we got to focus now? So what's the current critical path? Any current and anticipated delays and what the corrective action, supply chain issues, a bunch of stuff about buyout status, allowance,
a lot of that
cash
stuff,
flows.
Joe, is covered in the project meeting minutes, but I think it gets lost in translation. And I think, recapping it to some degree in the documents that you're kind of going through right now, there's value for that.
Yeah, and then the last two items after all the cost-related stuff were safety and government and community compliance. So BRJP, health, sanitation, whatever, all those type of things. So it's a nice little
checklist.
It's a nice little executive summary. It's got a quick dashboard if you only want to see, hey, do I have any issues? Nope. Oh, wait, they're all green? Good, I don't want to read it. Hey, something's yellow and red. I want to read yellow and red. And then if they do, there's all the background in here. So
executives of companies and owners, I think that would be the go-to.
Yeah, it's a great little report, and I'm definitely going to put this out for public consumption really soon. And Scott was a big part of this. So I will say this: anytime we go in and do, everyone usually says, let's do the scheduling 101, which you do like the whiteboard session on. We do that, and inevitably somebody's like, hey, can we do something in P6 or Microsoft Project? Do we have like a basics of so we can teach everybody how to use it?
Right.
We're doing that, and then once we're doing that, they're like, and they start understanding about updates. They're like, oh, could we have a class on updates?
Yeah, updates that's its own animal.
Yep. Can you help us with the template? And so Scott has been. There's other instructors that we have multiple levels of classes, but, Scott's really been one of the instructors where once he's in and doing the teaching, and, you've taught at MIT and Northeastern and all, Roger Williams, I think, right? Once you're in, it seems like people really want more. So I just want to say I appreciate that. I appreciate when I'm bouncing you around all over the place. And,
No.
It's great. I know you love it, so that makes me feel a little better. But Scott's excellent. So if you're interested in that, let me know, and we can schedule time.
Yep.
No pun intended, for Scott to come out and,
no
and
problem,
do a little
Joe.
teaching. I do very little plugs, but this wasn't so much of a plug as a way to say, compliment you because you do a great job. And
academia and teaching and mentoring is in my heart.
Yeah, you've helped a lot of people, and I know you say you're like, you're at the point in your business where you want to be doing more of the teaching,
right.
And letting staff do more of the actual scheduling, even though you have great institutional knowledge. With that said, I think even if people are, if you like scheduling and you're interested in getting into scheduling, I know there's a shortage of schedulers, and I think Scott might even be, should I say, is it okay if I say that I think you'd be interested in talking to people if they're schedulers?
I guess. I'd rather be doing more of what we're doing now, Joe.
Yeah.
Quite honestly.
No, I know, but I meant
yes.
if there are people that are interested in getting into scheduling, maybe have them reach out
Absolutely.
to you. There might be a place at Project Controls for somebody else.
Yes.
So,
there is a shortage.
Yeah. Awesome. Scott, this was great. Thank you, and we'll see each other soon. Scheduling.
Thank you.
All right, take care.